429. 429. Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, this is my constant longing and prayer. Gladly I'll forfeit all other treasures, Jesus, thy perfect likeness to wear. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure is thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stand thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, full of compassion, loving, forgiving, tender and kind, helping the helpless, cheering the fainting, seeking the wandering sinner to find. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure is thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stand thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, Lord, I am coming now to receive the anointing divine. All that I am and have I am bringing, Lord, from this moment all shall be thine. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure is thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stand thine own image deep on my heart. Please mark in your songbooks, page 939, 939. Good evening.
Good evening.
Before we get started, is this one? There we go. There's one announcement Mike forgot about. I'm not sure if he's aware of it. Before you leave tonight, be sure and wish Donna a happy birthday. I'm gonna stand over here. What I forget? Donna's birthday. Or you didn't know. Be glad you did announce it. Anybody want to preach a few, preacher shooter? Endurance. What is endurance? All right. Ellen said the ability to stay with whatever you're doing. Donna, what'd you say? Oh, you said?
The ability to withstand something.
The ability to withstand something. Both of those would be good definitions. Do we automatically have endurance?
You have to
Mike
train.
says no.
You have to train.
Huh?
You have to train.
You have to train. Sometimes that's true, right? But you might have some, but you have to build up. It's something that has to grow. Okay? And the reason we want to talk about that is because what are we going to need if we're going to make it to the end? Endurance. The Hebrew writer says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, the thing about endurance is, it's something that has to be active. There has to be something trying at it, something pulling at it. Some people can endure pain. How do they know how much pain they can endure? Paul said, go through pain. That is the truth. The only way you're going to know how much endurance you have is by going through something. And that's something about endurance in our faith, because that's what we're really talking about, is enduring in our faith. We have to endure to the end. Okay? There is no shortcut to heaven. In reality, there isn't, no matter how long we're on it. I was thinking today, how long do we have to run our race? Paul said till the end. Hello? Who knows how long? Sometimes we kind of wonder, we're going to get a little bit in this, how long does the Lord expect me? It's interesting, you read in the book of Revelation, the souls up under the altar are crying out, how long, Lord, how long before you avenge us? And he says, just a little while longer. He doesn't really tell them how long. And in the Lord's mind, how long is a little while? Elton shaking his head. I don't know. Think about it. Notice the point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Now, we understand Paul here is talking about something like in the Olympics, a regular race. How many people win that? Just one. Like Dale Earnhardt used to say, second place was the first loser. But what's the thing about our race? If we race to the end, we all win. Everyone who completes the race wins. Notice, and everyone who completes the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified. There's one for the once saved, always saved. Paul was constantly working. Possibly was constantly trying to better himself and keep himself from sin. There's a reality there. What are you talking about? What does Paul admit in that verse that we don't want to admit sometimes ourselves? That we're all sinners and that he himself at times sinned. That's hard to think about. When we look at the apostles, we think about, well, they had the Holy Spirit moving them. They never made a mistake. They never had one single illicit thought. They never did anything wrong once they got to that point. But that's not true. Paul in this verse admits that he had to face temptation the same way we face temptation. And the endurance and willingness to endure is what keeps us going. What makes a Christian repent when they recognize they've sinned? Guilt. A guilty conscience would move someone to sin. Tender heart. How about striving to have endurance? How many have a GPS? How many times your GPS got you lost? I don't know one that's happened to. What do you have to do if you realize your GPS has gotten you on the wrong track?
Get a new GPS.
Get a new GPS. Or make your own correction.
Sometimes you're not up to date.
That's it. Sometimes they're not up to date. Guess what? Sometimes we're not as up to date as we think we are. We may realize had something in our mind that we thought was right and we're wrong. Or something in our lives. Something that we should have in our lives that we don't have. We have to make the correction. Notice here the writer of Hebrews, and for those that may not understand, the book of Hebrews is really written to the Hebrews, trying to convince those who had started going back to Judaism. It's kind of something that's interesting with the Israelites, and it's something in human nature. We tend to want to go back to what we were comfortable with. Especially when the struggles get hard. When they came out of Egypt, they want to go back to Egypt. After Egypt was no longer a reality, and I don't know how long it took them to get that, but they kept wanting to go backwards to different things. Here they want to go back to Judaism. And the writer is trying to explain to them Judaism's day is almost over. And there won't even be a temple. But notice what he says, but recall the former days in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with serpents. Partly why you made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly why you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me and my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore do not cast away your confidence, which is great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe the saving of the soul. Dwayne this morning, I believe it was this morning, alluded to putting your hand to the plow, not looking back. You know, here's the thing, and sometimes it may be a bad thing for today, it may not, it may be a good thing. Who's persecuting us today?
Well, in context, you say today, church is in a way persecuting itself amongst its members because of outside things that go on. Whatever the reason, I feel that the church is dividing inside. That's how the devil gets you from the inside.
That does happen. A lot of times people do, and that wasn't really where my thought was. But yeah, there is that point of the devil trying to turn people against each other, and we see that happening in our own country right now. And I did. And a lot of times we do bring it on ourselves. We bring it on with ideas of why aren't we growing, or of other things. Because a lot of times what comes about in the idea of what can we grow, it comes about what can we do to grow that we're not already doing. And if we're trying to do what we're trying to do, and we're out there doing the reach out and everything, it comes down to, and you always will basically hear somebody, well, what if we did this? And it usually has nothing to do with doctrine or teaching. In fact, it's kind of tame. You know, I had one guy tell me one time that our worship's kind of boring.
Well, for somebody that wants to be entertained instead of entertain God, it could be kind of boring.
They were sluggish mentally. They had spiritual apathy.
Yeah.
So, and they, you might as well just go backwards and say, because you're not going forward.
Right.
So that's what was going on.
Yeah, but this person wasn't a member of the church, but they had visited at some point. But at the same time, we get people that we got to do something to change things around. We got to do something to attract more people. Those thoughts sometimes can hurt us more than they'll ever help us. There is a point there that we have to look at in persecution is what degree of persecution is going on. That might be kind of the problem today. There's not a great life or death struggle in being a Christian today as far as physical life. Not in our country. Not at this time.
I think we're so distracted in general by all the blessings that we have and the opportunities to entertain ourselves that, you know, we're blessed in a good and bad way. We're a long way from the struggle of day-to-day things all the time. Sometimes we get there, sometimes we have bad days, sometimes we have bad situations. But by and large, we're not facing that struggle, you know? So
We're not like the writer. We're not having to worry about being in chains and where the next meal is coming from most of the time, or even if our family's going to be safe. And Ron, I'll get you in a second because Ray started first.
the real sacrifice is not there.
There it is. The real sacrifice is not there. Yes, sir? I thought you said something. No, you didn't? Okay, I'm hearing things. My wife says that to me all the time. I'm hearing things. I think I'm hearing things, but no, I'm not supposed to hear. Ron?
There's a thing called the erosion principle, that if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you put him in cold water and turn the heat up very slowly, you will cook that frog to death and he'll never move. Our freedoms as Christians are being chipped away at slowly but surely by Satan and the opposition, to where some preaching now is considered hate speech, to where some assembling is considered illegal because of COVID, and little by little this heat is getting turned up, and if we don't pay attention to what's going on, we're going to be the frog in the pan.
And Ron's right. There, a lot of people aren't wanting to see it. And the excuses that are being made, in fact, more so not just religious freedoms. And he's right. Those that were here this morning, the lesson I preached in Canada, if I preached that lesson in Canada this morning, I could have been arrested for preaching hate speech. And there was no hatred in it.
He talked about throwing all these weights aside, throwing the sin aside to run a race. And when you're going to set out on a trip and you're carrying stuff, and most of us, you know, we throw it on a four-wheeler, we throw it in the back of the truck, you know. Rarely do we throw stuff on our back. But the example he's got, they're carrying. And if you ever carry a backpack full of stuff, you know, one more book or one more item or one more thing can make the difference between whether you make it there and you don't make it there. So you got to take something out. And in this case, he said, throw every weight aside. So it's not a question of one thing or two things. It's all things. It's being laid bare, because like with Jesus, when he carried that cross, he didn't carry that cross. You know, he didn't have a backpack on his other shoulder full of things. You know, he was practically naked. And he needed help
Carrying that
carrying the cross. You know, the Son of God needed help.
And it reminds us, we need help. And the idea that, he's right, the idea that what we don't need, we need to get rid of. Anything that would pull us backwards or away needs to go away. He mentioned hiking. When he's talking about it, I was thinking about it. Alex and I, we took a motorcycle trip to the Grand Canyon. You ever packed to go on a motorcycle trip? You don't have a whole lot of storage space. And what we did, and we learned real quick, this is going, this isn't. You know, that's like when these kids with us now, when we go on a road trip, the car ends up more full of snacks than it does luggage. Well, on a motorcycle trip, guess what? You might pack some extra water, but you don't pack a whole lot of food. And you don't do, and that's the thing that we need to realize is in this, what we don't need is what can actually draw us away. Paul?
This is going backward a little bit, you're ahead a little bit. You said something about your preaching in Canada, but just a couple of days ago, there was a restaurant owner in Nova Scotia was saying something against the government about COVID, and they shut it down.
Yeah.
Actual website we saw.
It's happening in New York.
He had been in government, not now, but they shut it down.
And that's the thing. There are those that are against everything. Now, notice that point, though. If anyone draws back, Paul, just teach you. My soul has no pleasure in it. We can't go backwards. Backwards is not going to get us in there. And we need the endurance. We have to endure things. I want you to think about Joseph. Little point here. Genesis 37, verse 2, we open up. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now, one day I was reading this, and between reading and the dreams, I realized Joseph had a big problem. Most Joseph's a big problem at 17, a lot like most 17 years old. Paul said he was a tattletale. Well, that was part of it, but the reason he was a tattletale was the same reason he had a problem with the dreams he had. What was that?
Had a big mouth.
Had a big mouth. Didn't know how to shut up. God used that. God used that to get Joseph to Egypt. And giving him the dreams. He knew his brother. And the fact that he had told on his brothers, that already made him angry. The fact that he was father's favorite son made him angry. All those things added up to the point where they sold him into slavery. Start with this verse for one main reason, though. How old was Joseph when he got sold into slavery? 17. How old was he when he stood before Pharaoh?
A lot older. It's like 40.
Somebody said 40. Not quite. The reason I say this is because when we think about it, we turn in 37, we see Joseph being sold into slavery. We see 38, we see the problems going on in Judah's life. We turn to 39, and we see Joseph as a slave in Egypt, ending up in prison, and then being in prison for unknown years. Okay? And then we do see him talking to the butler baker of Pharaoh and interpreting their dreams, and the butler promising to remember him when he's back before Pharaoh, but then it's another 2 years and he's still in prison after that. And when he foretells Pharaoh's dream and is appointed above him, it tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. How long do you have to endure being a slave and being a prisoner? 13 years? Hold on to that thought for a few minutes. In that time frame, he is married, he's given a wife by Pharaoh. It tells us that he has 2 sons. He called the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. Does that sound like a happy man? He's still remembering what happened to him. And the name second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of, what do you call it? My affliction.
Doesn't sound like he likes his job.
I think he liked his job as best he could like his job. Once you go back, I want you to understand something here. Went throughout all the land of Egypt. Guess where he couldn't go? Couldn't go home. He could not go beyond the borders of Egypt. You know how old he was when he finally told his brothers who he was? Now comes some real math. What happened? Back again, but oh, I left out somewhere I had a mental plan. Brain. In the that's slide. Oh, here we go. Come up back to that. In Genesis 45:6, we see for these 2 years the famine has been in the land. There are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. How long was the harvest? The years of harvest, great harvest. 7. What's 7 plus 2? What's 9 plus 30? 39 years before he saw his father again. Huh? Almost 40. There's where your 40 comes in. Yeah, that's where you're coming in. Now, add to that Jacob. These are some things that are wonderful about God. When Jacob comes to the land and stands before Pharaoh, Pharaoh asks him his age. He says, the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. They have been filled with sorrow, as one translation puts it, and struggles, but yet do not attain to the years of my fathers. Jacob sounded like a happy man when he stood before Pharaoh. He's happy that day because he's seen Joseph again. In fact, before he leaves the land, he says, it is good that, and now I can die because I will see Joseph's face one more. You know how long Pharaoh lived? Jacob lived in Israel or in Egypt with Joseph? Tells in that same reference 17 years. I always thought that was interesting. Joseph was 17 years old when he lost him. He got another 17 years with him at the end. So the real answer to how long did Joseph have to endure his land of his affliction? Would be 93 years. He lived to be 110. Only one time did he get to go back to the land of the Hebrews, as he called it, the area of Heber. That's where the Hebrew came from. And that was to bury his father. That's the only time Pharaoh let him leave the country. Moving on. Tribulations build endurance. How many of us like tribulations? Ron's over shaking his head. None of us do. But know what James says. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the test of your faith produces patience. Some translations use steadfastness there. The literal word is perseverance. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. What happens every time we go into tribulations? A lot of people blame God for it. So what,
I noticed that it says when you fall into various trials, not when you jump into various trials.
yeah. Too many people jump in headlong instead of it happening. They cause it instead of happening and letting it happen are different. But
But falling is kind of the feeling you have. It feels kind of like falling.
it does feel like falling. So that point comes back. How many of y'all take a test at school? How many times you take a test unprepared for it? None of them raised their hand. I heard somebody say a lot. I'm not sure who said it. But what happens when you're unprepared? Huh?
It doesn't go well.
What'd you say, Leah? You what? You wing it. You wing it. That's a good answer. You wing it. What happens when you wing it? What happens when you wing it?
Most generally, not good results. Sometimes you get really good results because you may have known more than you thought you did.
There's truth. Sometimes you may get better results than you expected because you knew more than you thought you did. Elton said, sometimes you're flying in the wrong direction. Gerald, I didn't quite hear what you said.
I forgot what it was.
He was winging it. Guess what? How often does the devil tempt us with what we're prepared for? Every second he tempts us, but how much does he tempt us in what we're prepared for?
If we're prepared, you can't get in.
If we're prepared, you can't get it. If we've already built up a resistance to that temptation, guess what he's going to do? He's not going to use that one. He's going to use the one we're weak in. That's what he's searching for, because he wants us to fall. He wants us to deal. It comes back to that point that when we're in a tribulation, and the reality, when people are really beating up on us and hating us, guess what? We don't like that. Nobody wants to be hated. Well, I'll take that back. There are some people out there. But most people don't want to be hated. They want to be liked. They want to be those things. But here's the reality. When we're in those situations, we were not really in a tug of war because we got the devil pulling hard on us, trying to get us over there. But yet we got God pleading with us to stay where we need to be, to turn to Him. That's the hard part about tribulation. Tribulation has been defined as what makes life hard. What causes the struggle? Well, in the spiritual life, it's what could draw me away from God. What makes it difficult for me to remain a Christian or remain faithful as a Christian. And so we need that endurance. Paul writes to Timothy, remember that Jesus Christ, at the seed of David, was raised from the dead according to my gospel, for which I suffered trouble as an evildoer, even to the point of change, but the word of God is not changed. What is he saying? I'm treated like I'm an evildoer. I suffer the things that an evildoer is supposed to suffer. But notice what he says, therefore I endure all things for the sake of the elect, that they also may obtain the salvation which is in Jesus Christ with eternal glory. This is a faithful saying, for if we die with him, we shall also live with him. If we endure, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. Here's the truth of the matter is, if we give up, how does that affect God?
He remains faithful.
He remains faithful. He stays the same. That's the ironic part is today, so many people are trying to change God, wanting God to change instead of changing to fit God. And the thing of it is, the only way we're going to be found faithful is if we stay faithful. We have to endure, no matter what other people do. There's one thing that I've come to realize, how many times do we have loved ones or people we care about, people in general, that we know are going the wrong direction, but our choice is either walk with them or walk away from them. Now here's the truth. What happens if we walk with them? We can lose our soul. If we stay down the path they're going, we're going to lose our soul. Here's what we're not ever going to do. We're never going to get them out of the mire by going into the mire. Have you ever heard of anybody convincing a drug addict that he needs help and needs to get off the drugs by starting to take drugs? What does it create? Just another drug addict that needs help, needs to get off the drugs. It's only by staying faithful can we ever hope to bring them into faithfulness. Does the devil love to see a Christian fall? Why? Huh?
It's just one more for him. And
One more?
And he's in competition with the Lord, so.
Yeah, that's true. He's in competition with the Lord. One more for him. What happens when we see elders and leaders of the church and preachers fall? Others go with it. The devil loves to see Christians, especially Christians who people know are faithful Christians, fall. Because it can discourage others. James writes in chapter 5, verses 10 through 11, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Again, that word perseverance. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Here's the truth, and somebody brought up a couple weeks ago about memories in heaven, and this is why I know deeply in my heart. Okay, I can't prove it as that, but I know in my heart that we're going to have our memories in heaven. We have been promised that every struggle we go through, heaven will be worth it. If we don't remember those struggles, how are we going to know it was worth it? The truth of it is, the harder the struggle, the greater the prize. And that is the promise when you look at Job. Everything he lost, everything he went through was multiplied in the end. I think Job forgot the days that Satan attacked him. No, that just made the end reward that much more reason to cherish. Endurance and steadfastness go hand in hand. Revelation 2:8-11, Jesus tells John to write, and to the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these things says the first and last who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation, poverty, but you're rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, that you may have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Prison for 10 days doesn't sound so bad, does it? But is that a literal 10 days?
Depends on the prison too.
Huh?
Depends on the prison.
Depends on the prison. Some of it might have been. Some,
Completion of your suffering.
a completion of the suffering. For some people, it's been lifelong. Go back and look at Joseph. The time we think we want a really long life, Moses said if we live beyond 80 years, it's suffering. Most of it. Some things we may not wish we'd never seen or had to endure. And sometimes we think in our life expectancy here that living as a faithful Christian, if we start in our teens and live all the way up to 80 and 90 years old, that it's been a long struggle. We may not have had to endure it as much as the Lord did in 3 years. And then again, we look back at those who were being challenged in their lifetime that lived hundreds of years. How would you like to have to be Noah, be told, guess what, I'm starting over and you're the one I'm starting with? I'd like to know that I'm the one that God wants to start over with, that He looks at me as being that faithful. But do I really want to be the only one that gets on the boat? Just me and my family. And have to preach about it for 100 years? And have all that ridicule and endure it? It's no wonder the Lord said that those had been, even ones that had been restrained in the time of Noah. The only way He kept them alive. Steadfastness and perseverance. Ron.
So why do you think it is that people fail to endure? What causes them to fall back?
A lack of strengthening their faith. Somewhere we tend to let go.
I noticed that in the Old Testament, Israel was always falling away from God back into idolatry. But none of the idolatrous nations ever fell away from their idols. They remained faithful to their idols the whole time, so they never fell back from them. But Israel kept falling back every time God would forgive them and bring them relief, and times would get good. They had a tendency to just get complacent and fall back again into this same cycle that it didn't seem to plague anybody else, because they just stayed in their idolatry. They never gave up their idols for centuries, and yet Israel had this same pattern of giving up every.
Well, let me ask you this. Which is easier? To conform to be like everybody else or to be different from everybody else?
Idolatry is being called without maybe your life change or to stop doing things that they enjoy.
You brought up this one about people going getting fishing, getting their boats and going and everything. Which is easier? In that aspect, when you look at the world, which is easier? Living as the world lives or following God?
There's a passage in 2 Corinthians, and you may be going there, so I don't know.
Go ahead.
2 Corinthians chapter 4. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal.
And so that answers your question.
I think that answers that question of why, because it's hard to follow something you can't see.
And it's easy to fall into what you can see.
And it's easy to fall into what you can't see.
Yep.
We take our eyes off the prize.
And that's the point. You know, that when you go back to what we read at 12, Hebrews 12 that we started with, the goal that is set before us.
Yes.
When you take your eyes off the goal, what happens? You tend to miss it.
You lose your balance just like a guy walking across a tightrope.
You talk, Elton said, you know, when you wing it, you might be flying the wrong direction. And you very well could be. Well, what happens when you take your sight off the goal? What happens to someone that's flying an airplane and they can't see? What if they're not instrument trained, or what if their instruments go out? That's what they say happened to Kennedy Jr. His instruments went out, and it was so dark that he couldn't see, and he didn't even know what altitude he was, and he just slowly descended right into the ocean. By the time he saw it, it was too late. That's what happens to a lot of people when they're not building up their faith. It's slowly deteriorating away, as you talked about, like with the frog, until by the time they see, they've lost their faith. It's too late. Israel did that a lot. Israel liked to go back to what they're comfortable with. Notice 1 Corinthians 15, 54 through 58. So when this corruptible is put on incorruption, and this mortal is put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Notice, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain to the Lord. Paul is telling that if you're going to get to this end, you have to stay steadfast. You have to have endurance. You have to be doing what's right. As we finished 1 John 5, 1 through 5, whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves him and who begot also loves him who is begotten of him. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is he who overcomes the world but he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? I've heard a lot of commentators and reading that text, and here's the thing that I've come to realize. I think God intends us to understand it's the one who wholeheartedly believes that Jesus is the Son of God, that carries with it the obedience, the dedication, the perseverance, the endurance, doing everything they can to be right with God. Notice that previous in the context, keeping His commandments. Obedience is built in there. It's added to it. That's our goal, is to be found right with God. And the only way we're going to do it is to keep on enduring right up to the end. Think about Peter. What caused Peter to sink when the Lord told him to come to him when he was walking on the water?
Took his eyes off Christ.
Took his eyes off Christ. And when he took off his eyes off Christ, what happened?
Started sinking. Saw the
He doubted. He doubted, and he started sinking. His faith deteriorated. We have to stay on the goal. Because without endurance, we're not going to make it. So when we stumble, we just have to get up and say, I'm going to try and do better next time, Lord. And ask for that forgiveness. And when we overcome something, we need to thank God for the strength that He's given us to overcome. If there's anything we can do to help anyone tonight, we'd ask you to come on and stand upon the same.
Oh, do not let the word depart, and close thine eyes against the light. For sinner, harden not thy heart, be saved, oh, tonight. Oh, why not tonight? Oh, why not tonight? Will thou evening that need to partake of the Lord's Supper. Okay? For those who do,